So this afternoon we're going to talk about some actual practical examples, and it's a great pleasure to welcome my friend and colleague Emma Vogel as our next speaker. Emma is the Director of SPS Consulting, an experienced director, and has worked across varied industries, but in particularly focused on change management, feasibility, business cases, risk assessments, and has a Bachelor of Commerce and a Bachelor of Engineering, and was the lead author of the Grampians GNet roadmap. And if you ever want to hear some good stories, ask Emma about the time she used to work in the Pilbara running a gold mine, but that's stories for another night. Emma, lovely to welcome you, and thank you for joining us today. I should also add that after our next few speakers, we'll be having just a short panel discussion as well. We will invite all the speakers back, so start thinking of any questions you might have for the group. Thanks, Emma.
Thanks, Stuart. And it was an iron ore mine, not a gold mine. Don't ask me about gold.
Same thing.
Yeah, same time. Okay. Excuse me. So I'll try and keep this brief because this is the worst. I think it was about 2018, released some funding for renewable energy roadmaps, and being aspirational, the Grampians region said, no, we're beyond that. We already have, we already know what potential we have in wind and solar. We want to drive from a regional and local level what it might look like to achieve zero emissions across all sectors. Beyond Zero Emissions, who some of you may be aware of as a think tank based in Melbourne, an academic think tank, and they provided a lot of the technical modelling that went into this, so it was quite robust. One of the challenges we did have, I should say, is that obviously a lot of climate change and zero emissions modelling is done on quite a macro scale, and trying to bring that down to even a regional level posed some difficulties. And what we really found through that process, it was a really comprehensive consultation process. We had involvement from some really heavy hitters in the world, so Ross Garno, some of you may have come to some of the forums that Ross presented at, and Alan Pears were involved. So it was about as robust as we felt we could get with the data that was available at the time. So what that showed is, and unsurprisingly to anybody from the region, the baseload economy of the Grampians region comes from agriculture. As such, and agriculture is a big emitter of carbon and methane, predominantly from animals. As you can see from the graph, not surprisingly, most of our emissions come from ag. So we went through this process, and then we said, well, what next? So probably a bit different to a lot of roadmaps that you see. We didn't just say, well, this is where we are and this is where we want to get. We tried to tie that back to some local and regional actions that people could, or organisations could take and implement, and that's what's, I guess, brought us here today. So we had three main focuses that came out of that, and if you're interested, you can go and have a look on the GNet website. There's a whole heap of fact sheets by sector there that's got some information and some suggestions of what individuals or communities or industry could do to help move the region towards zero emissions. But agriculture, we had a similar forum to this a few weeks ago for ag. Community energy, which is coming up. I'm not sure if there's a date set yet, Kylie. And energy as an enabler. So, and I guess what we're here to talk about is what does energy as an enabler mean? So we've heard a lot today about large-scale transition to renewables in particular, so both at a community and individual perspective, but also transitioning from coal to renewables and what infrastructure is required to do that and what some of the benefits could be to regional communities. So lots of focus by government on, I guess, the direct regional benefits that can happen from investment in transmission and renewable energy in particular. And so keep in mind, obviously during construction you've got a lot of jobs created. But not so much focus, this is where it gets a bit more difficult, on what industry and what jobs are unlocked if you have cheap, renewable and reliable energy. And so a bit later on in the presentation I'll be covering a specific example of what that might look like. And I'll just go back, I think it was Michael Polshin's question to Alistair Parker raised a really pertinent question for this presentation. Is we traditionally, and particularly in Victoria, we traditionally, with major change and major investment, the regulatory system and hence communities are kind of trying to look at minimising impacts. So when a developer goes and develops a project, they try and minimise impact on communities, the environment, traditional owners. What we don't measure, and we tend not to focus on either in a community or in a regulatory environment, is what is the opportunity cost if this doesn't go ahead? So what does this project bring that is wider than just this project? And energy is a great example of, and along with water, of one of those essential services that if it's done really, really, really well and change is embraced by communities, that it can unlock a whole wealth of other industry development that perhaps people had not thought of. An important part of that is educating local governments, communities and individuals to think more about, as Michael said, what are the opportunities of this project than, you know, what are the bad things about this project that it's doing to me? Because I guess to put not too fine a point on it, capital, and we're talking about big bits of capital here, so the renewable energy transition, for example, without any further development, is estimated to be about $16 billion in this region alone. Now, a large part of that will be paid for by consumers, so that's what the RIT process is about, is making sure that transmission provides value to consumers. But a large part of that is going to be funded by private industry, and private industry capital is a bit like energy itself. It flows down the path of least resistance. So if we are really serious as a region, about bringing as much capital and growth and change into our region as possible, we need to get to a cultural shift where we are working with government and industry to make sure that we are bringing as much money as possible in, and that money is staying in the region as much as possible and benefiting our communities. And that's going to be a really large cultural shift that I'm sure any of the people in the room that work for economic development organisations would agree. So some of the actions, I just thought I'd quickly run through for those that are unfamiliar with the roadmap. Some of the actions that came out of the roadmap you can see up on the up on the board. They're pretty tangible. They don't seem that hard, except it does require people to have to work together collectively and collaboratively to move some of these forward, because they're crossing sectors, and it is a big region. So our region, as you could see on the map earlier, runs from Bacchus Marsh all the way to the South Australian border. Big change in community culture from basically the peri-urban area of Melbourne right out to those remote areas in West Wimmera that the Grampians covers. So, almost half geographically of Victoria. So we've got a few actions up there, undertaken an energy audit of the region, and a few of the speakers have discussed a similar concept to that, and I think there is some work that has been happening between some of the organisations and DELP at looking at that. A regional advocacy group, TIC, GNET, advocating for the Grampians Region Res projects within VicGrid, which I think GNet and DELP Grampians have done a great job of. This one I just touched on earlier. So how do we get communities and councils development ready? And it doesn't matter particularly whether if you drive from Melbourne all the way to the South Australian border along the Western Highway, you will find billboards all the way about different projects that are happening, all the way from toxic waste, which Alistair Parker mentioned, to the Western Vic transmission line, all the way through when you get near Horsham, there's a whole heap of the Western Highway duplication, and all the way through mineral sands mines, all the way through to Horsham, you'll see anti-roadhouse signs. There's a proposal to put a roadhouse on the Western Highway. And so that is the kind of current community culture that if you're new to the region and you think when investors are coming in, they're driving through the region, that is what they see. So how do we get to those investors and say, yes, that is one part, and our expectation as a community is that you will work with our communities and you will provide the information, and, but how do we get to them at an early stage so we can work together to manage both the impact on those individuals that are heavily impacted, like the farmers that infrastructure's going through, but also get there early enough so that their plans really benefit our communities, and as much of that money is landing in the region as possible. So you can see some points up there. I think workshops such as this go a long way to actually raising awareness, and I know Committee for Ballarat, Wimmera Development Association and other GNet and other organisations are really doing their part in trying to educate the wider community. It is a new space, I think as Richie has said, energy companies, it is a bit of a new space for them, this sort of deregulated part of the market, moving from coal into a bit of community energy, a bit of hydrogen, a bit of solar, it's very new and it's very groundbreaking, and in a country like Australia it's quite complicated because of the vast distances and the low population. So we've got a really good opportunity here as a region, not only with our natural resources and potential and our traditional willingness to work together to actually get to private industry and say, we want to do this well and we're happy to work with you. So that's the aim of some of those actions there. Again, I won't go through them because I'm pretty sure you can all read, but we want to be showcasing our region as a leader in renewable energy, because it is. So we have more, and you would have seen, I think Dharmika and Alistair both put up the RES plan map and the constraints mapping. We have an abundance of wind and solar, and anyone that lives sort of part west of Ararat will understand as you go further west, there really is too much wind and solar at times. And so we can use that for good. They're wide open spaces. There is I guess once you sort of, very generally speaking, get past about Ararat or Stall, I think as somebody earlier mentioned, they're really, really looking for investment. They want wind farms, they want solar farms, they want the transmission lines to connect them in. And the reason for that is their businesses and land packages are larger, so the impost on them is lower, and it gives them really good economic diversification in an area of the region with declining population and increasing disadvantage. Where it becomes more difficult is when you're putting large infrastructure in peri-urban areas, because then the impact on the individual is much larger. Now, unfortunately, we have to get through that to try and unlock everything in the West, and that's sort of the situation we're in now. However, as most of these large changes occurs, the further you go into the process, the easier it becomes, because every kind of, the unknown unknowns become known, and communities have a much better understanding of what that transition looks like and what the benefits might be as they start rolling out through the community. One of the really big challenges I think for industry is when and how to support local communities. So when Alistair touched on this, and so did Dharmika, there is the current planning system, without throwing stones at anybody, is not fit for purpose. It was fit for purpose 40 years ago, but it is not set up for a large-scale change like we are seeing here. And communities are in some ways almost engaged too early, and the burden of an EES process, for example, may take 3 years to get through. Now, if you're a landholder, that's a long time to be waiting to find out what the impact is on you. And so that whole system can have a burden on communities that, on another hand, they're sometimes engaged too late. So, as Alistair said, there has to be, and you will not get any argument from industry on this as well, there has to be some middle ground there. There needs to be a whole review of how that planning system works, and that needs to involve industry, it needs to involve government, and really importantly, it needs to involve community. And it's not just the community that is heavily impacted, but also the wider community, so the entire region, so that you are, at the same time that you are looking to minimise impacts on community, you're also maximising benefits to the wider region, because that's where you will get your biggest bang for buck. Not everybody wants to move to Newlyn or to Hopeton or to Lake Bolac. They will, however, potentially move to Ballarat, Ararat, Horsham. And so we need to engage those bigger bigger communities that may not be directly impacted, but bring them to the table pretty early on as well. And that also solves, I think, a lot of problems that industry grapple with, of how do we, who do we talk to when they're turning up? Who do we talk to, and how do we be good corporate citizens and make as much money as possible, stay in these communities we're impacting? So this brings me to my case study. So we've talked a lot about renewable energy. This is just one example of many that cheap, reliable power can unlock. So some of you may not be aware, but Western Victoria, besides having a lot of solar and wind, it also has a lot of sand. So on the north side of the Great Dividing Range, and Stuart's going to tell me to stop talking because I could literally talk about this for weeks, and you will see a lot. Now, I have not plagiarised the Mineral Council Guide to Mineral Sands. I actually did author it. So, but I have referenced for your, just to cover myself. So, Northern Victoria, so particularly Wimmera and the Mallee, is home to the world's largest mineral sands deposits. So it used to be an ocean until the Grampians kind of rised up and cut it off many, many years ago. Now, the change in, the digitisation, global digitisation and move to renewables has actually driven demand for mineral sands and rare earth products. So I'm sure you would have heard of critical minerals. Australia, a couple of years ago, signed an agreement with Donald Trump. At the moment, or up until very recently, it hasn't really flowed, the policy change has not flowed through yet, but China controlled about 93% of the world trade in critical minerals. Now, what essentially that means is at any stage they could cut off supply and there would be no raw materials for mobile phones, electric vehicles, wind turbines, and that was seen globally as a potential risk. So there has been a lot of policy change, particularly between the US and Australia, because we are so resource rich and obviously we are geopolitically strategically located, to focus on unlocking the particularly rare earths that that the country has. Now, more often than not, you probably have heard the term that Australia is like a giant quarry for the rest of the world. And there are many reasons for that, and that's what I want to talk to today. What role does our energy transition have in changing this other really large industry that's sitting on our doorstep? So you can see here, for every mineral sands project that gets up and running, very sort of ballpark rule of thumb, you get about 200 ongoing jobs. So you may have heard of Douglas or KWR. KWR is near Oyen, Douglas was near Hamilton. Iluka is the Australian leader in this industry. they had those two projects. They ran for about 7 years. What our resources, which are yet to be exploited for various reasons, one of the beauties of them is they're very large and long life, so up to about 100 years for each project. So that's 200 jobs, but it's not 200 jobs for 3 years during construction or 7 years during a short mine life. It's 200 jobs over several generations. And then in those areas, there is approximately a 3-to-1 employment multiplier. So for every job that mine creates, there is another 3 jobs created in the community because, you know, they start early and go and buy a bacon and egg sandwich and a coffee every morning. You know, their families go to the school, etc., etc. And they're highly paid jobs with large disposable income, which is really important if you're trying to build up a community. So you can just see up here, these are the sort of things that mineral sands are used for. Now, some of these you would be very familiar with, you know, aircraft, car paint, ceramics, house paint, toothpaste, but also a lot of those things like telecommunications, wind turbines, and cancer therapy, a lot of those things, those technology things that are becoming more and more important in society. So just how much does Australia have? So this is the opportunity we're looking at. So it all looks pretty sexy up there, doesn't it? You know, you can see that we have huge, massive reserves, and then over on your right, you know, you can see that comparison globally. And so we're dwarfing pretty much all known resources in other jurisdictions. Now, there's some really important drivers of minerals development, and is a very global industry, resources. So, you know, you just don't work in an iron ore mine in WA. You know, you will have global consultants working all the time. You could be transferred to a mine site in Brazil tomorrow. So it's a very globally mobile workforce. And when we're looking, or the industry, the royal we, when we're looking to invest, or industry is looking to invest, they look globally for resources. And there's a few, just to put it very simply, and obviously it's not, but you know, the few things that, key things that at the very first pass when you're looking at, okay, I want to invest in mineral sands, and these are the top 10 jurisdictions globally. We look at jurisdictional risk. And jurisdictional risk covers things like safety and security, which is a real thing, and that is always number one for mining companies. Can I keep my people safe? So any jurisdiction where there is the potential that getting that project up and running or develop is going to result in threats of harm or death to their people gets a bit of a black mark. Second one is for obvious reasons. The second one is labour force. Is there an existing labour force, and how much does it cost? Because the name of the game here is not to lose money, it is to make money. The third one is water supply, particularly in not all resources, but in mineral sands, water it's very heavily water dependent, even though you can recycle it, so the loss is quite low. So water supply and cost. And the fourth one is power. So they're not in any particular order, but they are the key, what I would call comparative variables, which I'll get to in a minute. So now in Victoria, you can see up here, they're the known deposits. Now in reality, that resource formation is pretty much contiguous. And one of the great things about mineral sands is, unlike coal mines, you're not left with a dirty great big hole in the ground that you then have to do something with. It is continuously rehabilitated. Once these mines get up and running, basically the farmer can go back and farm after about 12 or 18 months. Which is fantastic for these communities, because that land use can work with its existing land use, so you're not displacing any industry. so you could if you could imagine, the lines of the traditional mineral sands deposits, the blobs, are what's referred to as fine-grained mineral sands, which are a little bit harder from a quality perspective to get up and running, but the market has sort of risen up, and we're just about on the cusp of these things becoming financially viable. So I talked a bit before about comparative variable costs. So if you think, chemical inputs and things like that, they're all basically sourced from the same supplier globally. So whether I build my processing plant in Australia or whether I put it in China, the actual cost of that chemical does not really alter much. It's not going to drive a decision about where I'm going to put infrastructure. Now, mineral sands processing in particular is quite complicated. It's a multi-product resource. So you start with a mining unit plant, which is in the ground, water gets added, it gets slurried, it goes to a wet concentrator plant. It extracts, say, just loosely 100% of the material you extract goes in. 5% of that contains what is referred to as a heavy mineral concentrate. Now that is always, and 95% of it goes back in the ground, which is how it can be rehabilitated. And that's where the really interesting decisions start happening that can impact communities. At that point, the heavy mineral concentrate can either be just pumped over to a mineral separation plant, and you're looking at about $100 million for a mineral separation plant, where it will be turned into zircon, rare earths and titanium. Or it can be loaded onto a truck and go to a ship, or a rail or a train and go to a ship, and it can be shipped somewhere else, maybe in Asia, where they have cheaper labour, cheaper power. And then it has to go through a whole lot of subsequent processing before it hits your bathroom in the form of toothpaste or your house paint. So the next one is the zircon upgrade, the rare earth upgrade and the titanium upgrade. But what generally happens with mineral processing, and mineral sands is no different, is as you start refining products, it becomes more industrial and less like mining. In the Western world, because we are so heavily advanced from a technology perspective, you're looking at less people than you are in the third world, but your power prices start going through the roof. And you need reliable power. So the worst thing for one of these big processing plants is to have expensive and unreliable energy. Forget whether it's coming from renewables or coal. For this particular argument, obviously everybody wants to use renewables, but reliability is really, really important, and so is cost. And so what we've traditionally found is that with most products, if not all in Australia, not just mineral sands, we tend to do only what's often referred to as primary processing domestically, and then we ship over to a China or a Malaysia. And that is driven by cost, unit cost predominantly, and by the regulatory environment. Now, if we want to unlock, we don't want to become a quarry, we want to become an end user, and all of the benefits that come along with that, then we need really good power. And a classic example of how that's gone badly is in South Africa. Most of their economy was reliant on resources. All of a sudden, the government lost basically control of their power supply, and they had rolling brownouts all the time, and all of the big mining companies basically shipped out, regardless of how good the resources were. They just could not bear the burden of those plants going down because they get bogged. It can take weeks for them to get up and running again, and that's all lost revenue that can't be recovered. So that, I guess, is the big ticket item. Anyone that's read Roscano's Superpower will be familiar with this concept. It looks really easy. In actual fact, there's a whole heap of moving parts that have to happen. And a lot of those, although you might look at that and think, well, what's that got to do with community? Having communities ready for this sort of investment, and understanding what the potential is for their regions if we can get some of these energy projects unlocked, is a big part of the puzzle. It reduces our jurisdictional risk. It can provide, employment-ready communities, which is a big barrier for investors. That's it. Okay. I'll leave you with that.
I think we might. I think I might invite some questions. Yeah,
you don't want to do it on the panel? I'll go back.
Otherwise, yeah, hang around the microphone. Any questions from the room? I've written down one. I've got a killer question, but I'm going to save it for the panel.
Okay.
So, all right.
You're not going
Thanks.
to
Polton's.
Yeah.
Yeah, righto, Michael.
Just a quick one, Emma. I love it. A lot of conversations with understands around some of these things. I guess the scepticism is this notion of the rehabilitation of land. And I guess, is there evidence that so for communities to have confidence that that is the case? Is there evidence where you see that with really good case studies to say, no, this is the links and the
Yeah, so there are existing ones, and I think Aluka has taken, because they're looking at a project called Wim 100, which is near Balmoral, and they're actually building, so they've actually got some US and Australian government funding to build a rare earth processing plant, not in Victoria, because regulatory environment here is difficult, but in WA, and they have, I believe, flown some of their farmers over to have a look at that, at rehabilitation from existing mines, both in WA, there's examples in South Australia, there's examples in the border of New South Wales and Victoria. I know other companies have taken busloads of landholders, and you tend to hear from the minority in these sort of situations like that. Most landholders of potential or past mines you talk to are pretty comfortable. But that doesn't make the paper. Yes?
With mineral sand development, what impact can that potentially have on the GNet's net zero target? Or are the developing companies?
Well, I think that's where the renewable energy comes in. So if you are using renewable energy, a large portion of the emissions, so there's obviously any of the heavy machinery is emitting diesel, but a large portion of the emissions does come from the processing. So if you can tap in to renewable energy, then that goes a very, very long way.
Take a follow-on question from that is, does the energy and water demand point tend to be where the extraction occurs, or do you have multiple extraction points using?
So it's a single extraction point, and that tends to be the highest for mineral sands. That's the highest load of water and the lowest load of power.
Yep.
And then as you start processing it, it becomes more power dependent or energy dependent.
Thanks, Em. Thank you. If you were bored one night and you wanted to put together a list of the top 5 mineral sands experts globally, Emma's name would be on that. So it's a real pleasure to have you not only in our region but also part of this group. So thank you.